Hi, everybody. We're going to wrap up our classification unit today with talking about cladistics and understanding how genetic information and information from anatomy can kind of come together to help us better understand how to classify organisms. So up to this point, we've been talking about taxonomy. We learned all those taxonomic levels like the phylum, the class, the order, and taxonomy is really all about grouping and naming things. So when, that the subject of taxonomy started in the 1700s, scientists weren't thinking about evolutionary relationships. They were really just thinking about putting things together based on how they look. In the 20th century, biologists started this branch of science called cladistics, which was trying to build on what was already in place for taxonomy, but using genetic evidence to really understand which structures are truly homologous and help us better understand the evolutionary relationships between species. And so we're just going to kind of talk about this broadly and then come back to what we learned about hominids with our hominid skull lab and see how that can help us understand hominid evolution as well. So we've already talked a little bit about how looks can be deceiving, where even though a shark and a whale look very similar, really whales are more closely related to hippos, and genetic similarities and other things like the fact that whales and hippos both make milk are better indicators of evolutionary relationships than just looking at the shape of the body. And the same thing kind of comes into play in all kinds of groups because if you look at these three animals, a frog, a lizard, and a flamingo, you might just at first glance think that the lizard and the frog are most closely related. And we don't necessarily have enough information based on just looking at their bodies to know. So this is a diagram called a cladogram. And a cladogram is showing us how organisms are related based on what are called derived characteristics. These are going to be anatomical features that are truly evidence of shared common ancestry. And typically when scientists build a cladogram, they want not just anatomical evidence from the body, but they also are going to want genetic evidence to back it up as well. So the way that you would read and interpret a diagram like this is really that you can think about it being sort of like a family tree from bottom to top, looking at change over time. And the traits that are listed along here are going to show you how closely related the species are and traits that they share. So like a fish has vertebrae, which is a backbone, and a fish also has eukaryotic cells. An amphibian also has vertebrae, but at some point in evolutionary history, 4 limbs evolved, and so then everything above this point on the cladogram has 4 limbs. So the frog, the reptile, the bird, the rodent, the primate, those all have 4 limbs, and this branching point would be considered the common ancestor for those species. So you can use a cladogram to answer questions like this. You might be asked what derived characteristic separates the rodents and the primates from the other animals. And so if you look on the cladogram, there's a point right here for hair and fur. So that's a derived characteristic that's unique of this group. And as we've discussed, we would call this group mammals. They have hair and fur. They also feed milk to offspring. So there's other derived characteristics that go with this group too. You could also use this to really answer this question of who are the lizards most closely related to. And if you look at where the lizard is on the cladogram right here, and you look at where the bird is, like flamingo is a bird, they share actually 4 characteristics that are on here. The reptiles and birds both have eggs with shells. They both have an amniotic egg, which is a special kind of egg that has like a sac around it to protect the baby. We have that too, even though we don't lay, most mammals don't lay eggs. A pregnant mammal has a sac called an amniotic sac around the baby. So that hopefully helps explain that. But reptiles and birds have eggs with shells, amniotic egg, 4 limbs, and vertebrae, whereas the reptile, like a lizard and a frog, would only share 4 limbs and vertebrae and be eukaryotic. So I actually made a mistake in my slide here. Really, the lizard and the bird share 5 characteristics: eukaryotic, vertebrae, 4 limbs, amniotic egg, and eggs with shells. So clearly the reptile and the bird share more characteristics, and so we would consider them to be more closely related. So then scientists would also want to look at their genetic similarities, and it turns out if you look at any genetic evidence comparing a reptile to a bird and comparing a frog to a reptile, a bird and a lizard would actually have way more genetic similarities. And so we want to make sure that, when we draw a diagram of their evolutionary history, that we put them more closely related to each other. So when we looked at the hominid skulls, you answered some questions about the relationships between those species, and a lot of you realized that the Homo neanderthalensis is probably most closely related to the humans, and of all the species that scientists have discovered of hominids, Neanderthals are definitely the most closely related to humans. So on a cladogram like this, these branching points represent where a common ancestor would be. So this point would be the last common ancestor shared by humans and Neanderthals. All these species are in the genus Homo, and this branching point would be the common ancestor of those species. You guys looked at Australopithecus afarensis, and scientists think that possibly that species was actually the common ancestor of all of these, but the genus Paranthropus kind of branched off one direction, and the genus Homo kind of branched off in another direction. Humans and chimps share a common ancestor, and that common ancestor we think lived about 7 million years ago. Genetic evidence supports this as well, because humans and chimpanzees have a lot of genetic similarities. So if we wanted to label this as a cladogram using this idea of different characteristics, derived characteristics evolving over time, we'd probably put the dental formula at the bottom, because you guys saw in the lab that all the skulls had the same numbers of teeth, the same types of teeth. We'd probably put walking on two legs next, because we saw how most of the skulls that we looked at did walk on two legs, and that evolved pretty early on in hominid history. When you get up to the genus Homo, some of the defining characteristics are, having a bigger brain, more rounded teeth, using tools. And then as this process continued, one of the things that our species shared with Neanderthals were, more sophisticated tools, having jewelry and using fire, having more relationships, and, like burying the dead, having social interactions, and, sort of tribes living together. So you could kind of consider those things to be like derived characteristics as well. So I hope that this helps you understand a little bit better how we can think about anatomy and genetics and bring that together with evolution. And what I would like you to do now that you watch this screencast is please do the Cladistics Schoology homework, and that will be for your attendance today. Thank you.